The wind moves through the tall grass of the old Kentucky cemetery, a sound like dry paper rattling against a stone. It is a quiet place now, but for 30 years it held the most profound form of tragedy, a body without a name. The only marker was a simple, donated headstone engraved with the words, "Tent Girl, found May 17th, 1968. That inscription, brief and brutal, was all the identity she was permitted. It was a refusal to vanish, a quiet scream in a field of silent monuments. But to understand the true weight of those two words, to understand the decades-long silence that preceded them, we must first pull back to a different kind of silence, the kind that swallows a life whole. It begins not with death but with disappearance. Barbara Ann Hackman was born in 1947 in a small, tight-knit Pennsylvania town. She was by all accounts a bright and earnest young woman. Her childhood was defined by a quiet dignity, a characteristic that would later make her vanishing even more jarring to those who loved her. She was a presence, not a phantom. She left high school early, full of the restless energy that often defines youth, and soon after, she fell in love with a man named George Taylor. It was a whirlwind romance, marked by a hasty decision to marry that gave many of her family pause. George was an older man, a carnival worker who lived a life on the periphery, always moving, always setting up shop just long enough to collect the crowd's money before dissolving into the night. It was a life far removed from the quiet, predictable streets of Barbara Ann's hometown. Did she see adventure in that constant movement? Did she mistake instability for excitement? Imagine the conversation in the Hackman home, a daughter, barely an adult, announcing her intention to trade security for the endless, dusty road of the traveling carnival circuit. This was 1967. The world was changing, but for some the road was still a dangerous unknown. The marriage was brief, tumultuous, and hidden from the steady rhythm of Barbara Ann's life. She gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Shelley in October of 1967. A new mother, barely 20 years old, suddenly tied to the chaotic life of a traveling showman. The burden must have been immense. It was less than a year later, in the winter of 1968, that Barbara Ann vanished. George Taylor's explanation was thin, almost dismissive. He told her family she had simply walked away. She had grown tired of the life, he said. She had abandoned him and their infant daughter. He made it sound like an act of selfishness, a final, dramatic choice made by a young woman too weak for the responsibility of motherhood. Ask yourself, would a mother who had carried a child for 9 months simply surrender her in the dead of winter? The family tried to report her missing, but the bureaucratic wall they hit was immense. She was an adult. She had a husband who claimed she left voluntarily. She was a member of the transient carnival population, a world law enforcement rarely prioritized. The paperwork was filed, perhaps, but the real investigation, the urgent search, never truly began. Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor had become a statistic, a name on a neglected list, assumed to be alive somewhere, just choosing not to call home. Meanwhile, 3 states away, near the small quiet city of Georgetown, Kentucky, the landscape offered a far more terrifying truth. The date was May 17th, 1968. A local farmer, walking along a stretch of Interstate 75 that was still under construction, noticed something strange near the side of the road, hidden in the dense brush. It was a tightly bound piece of heavy green canvas, the kind used for a tent or a large awning. Curiosity, or perhaps an immediate primal sense of dread, compelled him to look closer. What he found inside was not equipment or refuse, but the remains of a young woman. Her body had been wrapped tightly in the canvas, secured with ropes, and left to decompose in the spring heat. The state of the remains made immediate identification impossible. The woman had been stabbed repeatedly, the violence of the act suggesting a crime of passion or explosive rage. The small county sheriff's office was overwhelmed. This kind of horrific transient crime did not happen here. This was a disturbance from the outside world, dumped on their doorstep. The initial investigation was a flurry of activity. Fingerprints were taken, dental records were sketched, and a detailed list of personal items found with the body was compiled. She was wearing a brass ring, a cheap imitation pearl necklace, and had a small scar on her left leg. Most crucially, she had a significant amount of unique and extensive dental work, including a porcelain crown and gold fillings, which should have been a clear link to a dentist, a file, a name. But the leads went nowhere. Fingerprints didn't match any known files. Dental records, circulated by mail across the region and beyond, returned blank. No one in the small Georgetown community recognized her. She was a stranger, transported from some other place by some other person, and left to be consumed by the Kentucky landscape. The investigators tried. They worked the phones. They contacted police forces along the interstate route, following the thin, fading threads of a traveling killer. They had DNA evidence of a sort, though the forensic technology of 1968 was a blunt instrument, incapable of delivering the crystal-clear answers that we take for granted today. They knew she existed. They knew she had been murdered, but they could not answer the only question that truly mattered. Who was she? The case quickly went cold, sinking under the weight of its own anonymity. Without a name, there was no starting point, no family to interview, no friends to provide a timeline. She was an anchorless boat, adrift in the vast ocean of unsolved crime. The community decided she deserved dignity, even if they could not give her justice. They provided the small burial plot, they donated the tiny headstone, and they gave her the name of the canvas that had contained her final brutal truth, Tent Girl. For decades, the case file sat in a locked cabinet in the sheriff's office, a testament to failure and an agonizing reminder of an unsolved evil. The young woman buried beneath the headstone Tent Girl had a family somewhere, a mother who grieved, a daughter who grew up without her. Her absence was a slow, crushing pain for them, while her presence in that cemetery was a silent, frustrating challenge for law enforcement. It would take a confluence of factors, time, technology, and one man's quiet, unrelenting sense of duty, to finally bridge the vast, 3-decade gap between Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor and the nameless Tent Girl of Kentucky. A connection that began not with an official tip, but with a casual conversation and a lifetime of unanswered questions. The failure to identify Tent Girl hung over the small Kentucky town like a heavy, unseen shroud. The detectives who had initially handled the case retired, and the file was passed down, its urgency diminishing with every passing year. The tragedy of the murder was compounded by the tragedy of anonymity. Imagine the detective opening that file years later, no photo, just a sketch, and a frustrating lack of a central identity. How do you hunt a ghost? The simple answer is, you often don't. The resources dry up, the trail grows faint, and the living cases demand attention. The victim was reduced to her few known possessions, the small inexpensive ring, the unique dental work, and the remnant of the green canvas tarp. These were forensic crumbs that, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, simply led to dead ends. They checked military surplus logs for the canvas, nothing definitive. They checked dental associations for the unique crownwork, no matches. She was, quite literally, untraceable. But the silence in the cemetery was not absolute. It was pierced by the curiosity of a local boy, Todd Matthews. Todd was born and raised near the cemetery where Tent Girl lay. As a young man, he was not a detective, nor was he related to the police or the victim. He was just an ordinary citizen, working as a heavy equipment operator. But the story of the nameless girl had been a constant, quiet presence in his life. The headstone was a local landmark, a piece of small-town folklore wrapped around a profound crime. It was a visible wound on the face of the community. Todd first heard the full, chilling details of the case in 1987, nearly 2 decades after the murder. He was dating a woman whose father, Wilbert Staub, had been a crucial part of the original police effort, the man who was called to the scene in 1968. Wilbert spoke of the case with a lasting, deep regret. The lack of closure was a professional failure that haunted him. He showed Todd the case file, the faded photos, the sketches of the few possessions. For Todd, something shifted. It was more than curiosity. It was a sudden, intense transference of the burden of conscience. He saw the photos, he heard the story, and he looked at the small, lonely grave. He realized that this was not just a case file. This was a person, a daughter, someone whose name had been stolen twice, once by her killer, and again by the system that failed to reclaim her. This is the psychological fuel of the citizen detective, the deep, innate human need for completion, for order restored. Todd Matthews, the heavy equipment operator, became possessed by the idea that he could give Tent Girl her name back. It wasn't about catching a killer yet. It was about reversing the profound injustice of her anonymity. He started small with the tools available to him in the late 1980s. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, to newspapers, to police departments in neighboring states, to missing persons organizations. He would detail the few known facts, the date found, the unique dental work, the brass ring, and the location. He used his lunch breaks and his evenings, dedicating every spare moment to this task. He was met, overwhelmingly, with silence. His letters either went unanswered or were met with polite professional dismissals. He was an outsider, an amateur. Why would a seasoned detective in Ohio take a tip from a Kentucky construction worker? But Todd was relentless. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He was looking for a single small spark of recognition. He began to organize the details of the case in his own mind, running different scenarios. She was likely transient, part of the carnival crowd George Taylor had been involved in. She was found near a major interstate construction site. She had to have been brought from somewhere along that travel route. This line of reasoning was logical, but without the power of the state, it was just theory. Then, a technological revolution began to creep into everyday life: the World Wide Web. In the mid-1990s, the internet was a chaotic, unorganized place, but it was also a place where voices that had been ignored could finally be amplified. Todd recognized its potential not as an entertainment platform, but as the world's most comprehensive searchable bulletin board. He began building what he called the Tent Girl website. Imagine this moment: a man who operates bulldozers by day, sitting in front of a flickering monitor by night, learning HTML and coding simply to give a dead woman a voice. This was not the work of a forensic team. This was passion given digital form. He transcribed every detail he knew, including the dental records and a chilling artist's sketch of the victim. He created a space where the missing piece of the puzzle might finally see the light of day. This online effort was at first a whisper. The site received a few visitors a day, but it was a global message, an appeal to the collective memory of the world, something local police departments could never achieve with their static flyers and regional memos. Todd's work was the true pioneer of online cold case sleuthing. It was during this period of constant digital searching that the case began to take on a strange mirrored identity. While Tent Girl had been missing for 30 years, her family in Pennsylvania had been searching for 30 years too, albeit under the false premise that she was alive and had abandoned them. George Taylor's lie had created a profound misdirection. Remember George Taylor's story. Barbara Ann simply walked away. This was the narrative that stifled the original investigation and inflicted deep psychological damage on the Hackman family. Her mother, waiting by the phone, agonizing over the possibility that her daughter had simply chosen a life without her. The daughter, Shelley, growing up believing her mother had willfully abandoned her as an infant. It was a brilliant, cruel kind of murder. George Taylor didn't just take her life. He stole her reputation and erased her love for her child, ensuring the trail would remain cold because her own family was looking for a living runaway, not a buried victim. This psychological complexity is what elevates the case beyond a simple murder mystery. Todd Matthews, unknowingly, was working to undo a decades-old psychological assault, not just a physical one. His website, his letters, his constant quiet insistence that this woman mattered, eventually created the necessary cross-current in the digital stream. The case was moving out of the physical confines of the Kentucky file room and into the vast, interconnected web of human memory. The narrative tension now rests entirely on that digital thread. Will the right person, the one person who remembers the porcelain crown or the tiny scar, stumble upon the obscure web page created by an anonymous construction worker in Kentucky? The odds were astronomical, a digital needle in a digital haystack, but the power of one man's unwavering focus was about to prove that sometimes persistence is a force more potent than any police procedure. The wait, however, was nearly over. It was a quiet Sunday evening in 1998, 30 years after Tent Girl was buried. Todd Matthews was doing what had become his ritual, checking the visitor logs and the sparse message board on his fledgling website. He had endured years of silence, dismissed emails, and the general apathy that attends cold cases. But he knew, with a certainty that bordered on faith, that his digital message would eventually find its intended recipient. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, came not from a massive police tip line or a newspaper expose, but from a single, unassuming email. The subject line was simple, direct, and devastating. "I think I know who Tent Girl is." The message was from a woman named Rosemary Westbrook, living in Ohio. She had been searching for information about her long-lost half-sister, Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. Rosemary had gone through the motions of searching, calling police departments, looking through missing persons registries, all based on the decades-old lie that Barbara Ann had abandoned her family. The official records, if they existed, described a living runaway. But a local Ohio newspaper had run a small, archived article about Todd's unique website and his relentless search for Tent Girl. Rosemary had followed the link, skepticism turning to sickening recognition as she studied the artist's sketch on the screen. The eyes, the small curve of the mouth, it was Barbara Ann. The details in Todd's detailed description cemented the terrifying connection. Rosemary remembered two things that no one else would have known: the unique, extensive dental work, including the porcelain crown, and the small scar on her left leg, the result of a childhood accident. These were the forensic fingerprints of a life, preserved only in the private memory of a sister, and the diligent notes of a civilian sleuth. Imagine the phone call between Todd Matthews and Rosemary Westbrook. Two people, strangers, connected by a 30-year-old murder, and a shared mission to reclaim a lost identity. Todd, who had only known her as a nameless grave, now heard the intimate details of her life, her laughter, her dreams, the pain of her loss. Rosemary, who had endured decades of uncertainty and shame, finally realized her sister had not been selfish. She had been murdered. The emotional energy of that call was monumental. It was the moment the fictional Tent Girl died, and the real Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor was reborn. The moment the name was established, the case pivoted violently. The police investigation instantly transformed from a frustrating search for who she was to a focused hunt for who killed her. Todd immediately contacted the Scott County Sheriff's Office, carrying the weight of 3 decades of truth on his shoulders. The police, initially hesitant, were forced to take notice. The details were too specific, too accurate to ignore. The porcelain crown was the key. The local authorities began the meticulous process of cross-referencing their original files, the 1968 dental sketches, with the records supplied by the Hackman family in Pennsylvania. The match was instantaneous and absolute. The anonymous victim in the Kentucky soil was confirmed to be the missing mother from Pennsylvania. This was the discovery of the victim 30 years late. The next step was a painful necessity: a formal exhumation. In 1998, Barbara Ann's remains were lifted from the ground she had occupied for so long. The process was solemn, marking the end of her life as Tent Girl and the official start of her journey home. Forensic scientists were now able to collect modern, viable DNA samples, something impossible in 1968. They finally had the tools to pursue justice, armed with a name and irrefutable genetic proof. The identification brought an immediate, chilling clarity. The killer had to be someone close to her at the time of her disappearance. Suspicion, naturally, fell on the man who had the motive and the opportunity, and who had created the decades-long cover story: George Taylor, Barbara Ann's husband and the father of her child. Barbara. The narrative of abandonment, the lie that George Taylor had maintained for 30 years, now collapsed completely. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had disposed of her body, and then manufactured an elaborate, psychologically damaging cover story to keep the police and her family off the trail. This was the cold, calculated manipulation that truly shocked investigators. The trail led police to George Taylor's last known whereabouts. He had continued his life in the carnival circuit, moving state to state, rarely staying still. This transient lifestyle had served as his perfect shield. Police tracked him down, ready to confront him with the DNA evidence and the forensic details from the 1968 crime scene, details only the killer could know. But the final twist of the knife came not from a confession or a dramatic arrest, but from a mundane record search. George Taylor had died of cancer in 1987. The primary suspect, the man who had lied for nearly 2 decades, was beyond the reach of the law. The physical evidence, the ropes, the canvas, the unique characteristics of the stab wounds all pointed to him, the man who was last seen with her. The case was solved, but justice in the legal sense was forever barred. This development introduced a new, complex type of grief for the family, the undeniable truth of his guilt, coupled with the frustration that he would never face a courtroom. It was a profound, bittersweet closure. Barbara Ann was no longer tent girl. She was a named victim, her memory cleared of the stain of abandonment, her identity restored by the tenacity of a man who had never met her. Todd Matthews, the amateur sleuth, had achieved what 3 decades of official investigation could not. The discovery shifted the focus of the narrative entirely. It became less about who committed the murder and more about the incredible power of private dedication. It left one crucial, lingering question. Now that they knew the killer had escaped legal consequences, what would happen to the legacy of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor? And what about the man who finally gave her peace? The moment the case was closed, solved but unprosecutable, the story of Tent Girl fractured. For law enforcement, the file was finally put to rest, the name Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor written in ink where unknown female had stood for 30 years. For the Hackman family, it was the end of a long, agonizing uncertainty, trading the pain of abandonment for the certainty of murder, a truth that, paradoxically, brought a strange kind of peace. The perpetrator had faced his own end, removing the spectacle of a trial but leaving a void where true accountability should have resided. But for Todd Matthews, the job was not finished. It had merely evolved. He had given Barbara Ann her name, but he felt an obligation to honor the debt of 30 years of silence. He recognized that the real success was not just in solving the cold case, but in proving that the gap between a missing person and an unidentified body could be bridged by collective human effort. His work had demonstrated a powerful and largely untapped resource in crime solving, the engaged citizen. The immediate aftermath was intense. The media, which had periodically covered the Tent Girl mystery as a piece of local folklore, now swarmed the story of the identification. Todd Matthews found himself thrust from the quiet anonymity of his construction job into the spotlight of national true crime. He was hailed as a hero, a pioneer of internet sleuthing. But his focus remained entirely on the victim. He helped arrange a second proper burial for Barbara Ann, ensuring she was finally laid to rest under her true name, with her family present, concluding a chapter of profound disrespect and negligence. However, the psychological weight of the case did not lift with the identification. The family still had to contend with the insidious nature of George Taylor's crime. He had stolen her life, and then, through calculated lies, he had stolen her memory and the grieving process from her loved ones. The complexity of the family's grief was now centered on their daughter, Shelley. Shelley had grown up believing her mother had simply vanished, a difficult, painful narrative that colors a child's self-worth. Now she was told the truth. Her mother was a victim, murdered by the man she called her father. The psychological fallout from this revelation was immense, a foundation of lies that stretched back to her infancy. The discovery of the truth provided closure, but it also opened a new wound, a deep, pervasive betrayal. The script now moved from the physical pursuit of a killer to the emotional consequences of his deceit. The authorities, despite their gratitude to Todd, maintained a careful distance. They recognized the power of citizen engagement, but the structure of formal investigation relies on procedure, rules, and boundaries. The idea that a case could be solved by someone searching ancestry message boards and creating a simple website challenged the established order. This created a tension that would soon become the focus of Todd's new crusade. He realized that if he, one man with a dial-up modem, could solve this case, there must be thousands of other Jane and John Does waiting to be named. This realization was the genesis of a massive, self-appointed mission. He co-founded the Doe Network, a volunteer organization dedicated to using the internet to match unidentified victims with missing persons reports globally. This shift in focus represents a crucial turn in the narrative. The story moves from a single murder to a broader social and procedural problem. We are no longer focused solely on Barbara Ann, but on the systematic neglect that allowed her, and countless others, to remain nameless for so long. Ask yourself, in a world where every single transaction, every phone call leaves a digital footprint, how is it possible for thousands of people to vanish without a trace? The answer lies in the inefficiency of cross-referencing records across jurisdictions and the lack of a centralized, accessible system for matching the living with the dead. The police had the dental information. The family had the dental information. But because they were separated by state lines and 3 decades of bureaucracy, the 2 points never connected until an amateur citizen forced the link. This disconnect became the target of the Doe Network. Todd and his team of volunteers began the tireless, frustrating work of building a database, compiling publicly available information and utilizing the nascent power of forensic anthropology and the growing public interest in DNA and genealogy. They were doing the slow, meticulous administrative work that police departments often lacked the resources or jurisdiction to handle. They became the bridge between the missing and the found. This new procedural struggle, the fight against bureaucratic inertia and the systematic failure of cross-communication, provides the necessary procedural strain for this part of the script. It wasn't a fight against a killer, but a fight against a flawed system. Every successful match made by the Doe Network became a quiet triumph, a validation of the core principle Todd learned from Tent Girl, that every person deserves their name back. The story of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, the woman who started as a nameless grave, transformed into the founding symbol of a revolutionary grassroots movement. Her death became the impetus for 1,000 others to be named. The question that lingers at the end of this chapter is whether this new citizen-led revolution can truly integrate with the established rigid world of formal law enforcement, or if they are destined to remain perpetually on the false trails doing the good work that the system cannot or will not do for itself. The tension between the amateur and the professional detective continues. The years following the identification of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor were defined by a strange procedural conflict. The official world of law enforcement was slowly accepting the technological tools offered by the civilian sphere, but still struggled to fully integrate the decentralized, passionate energy of groups like the Doe Network. This tension became the new battleground for justice. The police had the power of subpoena. The amateurs had the power of relentless human memory and the internet. Todd Matthews and his volunteers found themselves constantly navigating this professional chasm. They would identify potential matches based on geographical data, unique physical characteristics, or obscure family lore posted on message boards, and then present their findings to the relevant police agencies. The reaction was often a mixture of cautious interest and ingrained skepticism. For many detectives, it felt like taking direction from a hobbyist, a psychological hurdle that proved difficult to clear. Imagine the frustration. The Doe Network volunteers, often working off basic laptop screens late at night, would connect a missing person report from Arizona in 1975 with an unidentified body found in Florida in 1976. They would provide the probable link, but they lacked the legal authority to force an exhumation or compel DNA testing, the final, irrefutable step. They were stuck on the edge of the breakthrough, eternally needing official validation. This era, the early 2000s, was the age of procedural strain. While the technology was rapidly advancing, the process of investigation remained mired in old habits. DNA databases were fragmented. Missing persons reports were often filed only locally, making cross-state matching a tedious manual process. The system was designed for efficiency, but not for the complexity of a transient, anonymous life like Tent Girl's. The media, always hungry for a narrative, often framed Todd as the hero who succeeded where bureaucrats failed. While this narrative fueled public interest and the Doe Network's growth, it did little to foster a collaborative environment with law enforcement. This created a profound irony. The very person dedicated to helping the police solve their hardest cases was often viewed with suspicion or resentment by the officers themselves. We must reflect on the mindset of the detective opening a cold case file from 20 years prior. They are looking for physical evidence, forensic science, and witnesses who remember details from decades ago. They are not looking for a website link provided by a stranger in a different state. The fundamental rules of evidence acquisition were being rewritten by technology, and the institutions built on those old rules struggled to adapt. The story now follows the slow, grinding shift in that mindset, a change fueled by the increasing visibility of the Doe Network's quiet successes. Every new Doe identified, every family reunited with a lost loved one, was a procedural win, proof that the collaboration worked. The victories were often small, occurring in obscure corners of the country, but they were cumulative. For Barbara Ann's immediate family, the years after the identification brought necessary reflection. Her daughter, Shelley, now an adult, had to reconcile the man she knew as her father with the fact that he was her mother's killer. The truth brought a closure that was both painful and liberating. She was able to mourn her mother not as a deserter, but as a victim of domestic violence, a profound shift in her personal narrative. This emotional grounding is vital. The script must constantly return to the human cost of the crime and the long tail of its deceit. Todd's relentless dedication, born from that initial conversation with Wilbert Staub, began to define his life. He wasn't just a construction worker anymore. He was a full-time advocate, sacrificing his free time, his financial stability, and his peace of mind to the service of the nameless. Ask yourself what kind of conviction it takes to dedicate your life to the dead, strangers you have only known as sketches and bone fragments. It is a profound, almost spiritual sense of justice. The narrative tension is now set on the horizon, the next great technological leap. While the internet had allowed for the matching of missing persons files, it was the rise of forensic genetic genealogy, the ability to use consumer DNA databases to find relatives of unidentified bodies, that would truly revolutionize the landscape. The Doe Network was operating in the final transitional phase before this explosive breakthrough. The procedural strain was reaching a breaking point. The number of John and Jane Does was not decreasing fast enough. Todd's work was valiant, but the official system needed a shock to the core. A new tool was required, one that didn't just match reports, but could definitively name a body where no one was even looking for them. The foundation for this major pivot was being laid by everyday people uploading their DNA to ancestry sites, unknowingly creating the ultimate crowdsourced database for cold case solving. The stage was set for the next chapter, a true pivot in the history of unsolved crime. The relentless work of the Doe Network and others like it brought the pressure to bear. But the true pivot in the investigative narrative, the moment the system cracked open, was not driven by policy change, but by a revolution in private technology. The breakthrough had less to do with police procedure and everything to do with DNA, genealogy, and the public's eagerness to learn about their own family histories. For years, forensic analysis relied on CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. This system only worked if the killer or the victim had previously been arrested, convicted, or had voluntarily submitted their DNA. If a victim, like Barbara Ann, had a pure life with no connection to the justice system, CODIS was useless. It could confirm a match, but it could not provide a lead. The turning point came with the rise of consumer genetic genealogy, companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. Millions of private citizens, curious about their heritage, willingly submitted their DNA profiles. While these commercial sites protected their data, a separate landscape emerged. Open-source genealogy databases like GEDmatch, where users could upload their raw data for broader matching. This created a colossal, crowdsourced pool of genetic information, a vast map of humanity's shared family tree. The new concept was revolutionary and ethically complex. Investigators could now take an unidentified victim's DNA, or even the DNA left by an unknown perpetrator at a crime scene, and upload the profile to these public genealogy sites. The goal was not an exact match, but to find a close relative, a third cousin, an aunt, a great-uncle, and then use traditional genealogical research to build a family tree backward in time, triangulating the identity of the target individual. This technique transformed the 30-year-old case of Tent Girl into a historical footnote, a symbol of the old way of doing things. The frustration Todd Matthews had experienced with paper records and limited databases was now being solved by a search engine that could literally peer backward through generations. The true significance of this pivot, however, was felt in cold cases across the country. One after another, seemingly unsolvable mysteries, some 30, 40, or even 50 years old, began to yield. The Golden State Killer, the first major public success of this new method, demonstrated its overwhelming power, and suddenly, the law enforcement resistance to amateur methods crumbled. The skepticism was replaced by a pragmatic, urgent need to adopt the technique. Imagine the atmosphere in a small underfunded police station when a cold case detective, having struggled with a file for decades, hears that a volunteer genealogist in another state found a third cousin of their victim using a website dedicated to family trees. It was a paradigm shift, a true unexpected breakthrough that came from outside the established walls of justice. The narrative tension now rests on the vast number of unidentified remains still lying in cemeteries across the country. Todd Matthews and his colleagues were validated not just by Barbara Ann's identification, but by the fact that the entire investigative world was now scrambling to catch up to the model they pioneered. The focus shifted from if a Doe could be identified to how fast that identification could be achieved using genetic technology. But the ethical reflection is crucial here. The method relied on the voluntary submission of private DNA. Did people realize that when they submitted their sample to learn about their ethnic mix, they were also potentially providing evidence that could identify a distant relative as a killer or identify a forgotten victim? The tension between public safety and genetic privacy became the new ethical front line of true crime. For Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, the closure had arrived just before this massive genetic wave broke. Her identity was restored through the sheer force of human will and early internet ingenuity, a triumph of community over code. Her legacy, however, was in the adoption of those new technologies to help those who came after her. Her story became the rhetorical proof used by advocates like Todd Matthews to push reluctant agencies into embracing genetic genealogy. The silent, decades-long prayer of the nameless was finally being answered by the very fabric of human lineage. The next crucial phase would involve the emotional reckoning, the confrontation with the past, and the profound, tangible effect of the truth on the surviving loved ones. The focus would move from the technology that restored the name to the grief and healing that followed. The identification of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor was not a climax, it was a detonation. The explosion of truth detonated by Todd Matthews' quiet persistence sent shockwaves through the Hackman family, particularly her daughter Shelley. For 3 decades, the emotional narrative of Shelley's life was centered on the belief that her mother had willingly abandoned her. Abandonment is a heavy, corrosive emotional scar. The discovery that the mother had not chosen to leave, but had been stolen by the father, rewrote her entire past. Imagine the confrontation in Shelley's own mind. The man who tucked her into bed, who provided the comfort and stability she knew, was the same man who had orchestrated the disappearance and subsequent erasure of her mother. The man who had maintained the lie for 19 years until his own death, ensuring the stain of abandonment stuck to Barbara Ann's memory. This is the profound psychological consequence of a calculated crime, a second layer of malice that victimizes the surviving family for decades. The truth freed Shelley from the shame of feeling abandoned, replacing it with the profound pain of betrayal. It allowed her to finally grieve her mother as a victim, a process that had been unjustly postponed for 30 years. The confrontation in this case was not with the killer. George Taylor had escaped that reckoning, but with the reality of his 2-decade-long deceit. The emotional climax reached its peak with the second proper burial. Barbara Ann A.'s remains were exhumed from the plot-marked tent girl and finally laid to rest with a headstone bearing her real name. It was a confrontation with the past in its most tangible physical form, the erasure being reversed, the identity restored. For the family, the ritual provided a necessary, long-delayed opportunity to say goodbye to Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor and to simultaneously bury the painful phantom of Tent Girl. This public act of reburial became a media event, turning the local tragedy into a national story of redemption. It was the moment the narrative shifted from mystery to legacy. Journalists flocked to interview Todd Matthews, seeking to understand the quiet power of the amateur detective. He used every platform not to glorify his own efforts, but to shine a light on the thousands of other nameless individuals waiting in morgues and cemeteries across the country. Todd's confrontation, unlike the family's, was directed at the system. He used Barbara Ann's story as a relentless rhetorical battering ram, pointing out the procedural flaws that allowed her anonymity to persist for so long. He challenged law enforcement and politicians. If a single, untrained citizen could solve a 30-year-old murder using a website, what systemic failures were preventing official agencies from utilizing the same principles? This period solidified the ethical framework of the case. The narrative consistently prioritized victim dignity. The story of Tent Girl was no longer about the gruesome discovery. It was about the resilience of human connection and the debt owed to those lost. The constant media focus on Todd Matthews, the hero, was balanced by his own humble insistence that the real hero was Barbara Ann, whose remaining forensic details demanded recognition and whose family never stopped searching, even when they didn't know what they were searching for. The legal system's final involvement was anticlimactic. With George Taylor deceased, there was no trial. The official finding was rendered, homicide, perpetrator identified, and the case was permanently closed. There would be no cross-examination, no public confession, no final verdict delivered by a jury. The court of public opinion was the only one that rendered judgment on George Taylor's character. The lack of a trial meant that the ultimate confrontation occurred in the realm of public memory. The community of Georgetown, Kentucky, was forced to reckon with the fact that for 3 decades, a killer had likely been moving freely along the interstate, a shadow of violence that passed through their quiet town, and the wider public was forced to confront the chilling notion that anonymity, for a traveling worker like Taylor, was the perfect shield against accountability. The story of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor now stood as a stark monument to the power of the lie and the power of human connection. The final chapter of justice was not legal, but restorative, restoring a name, restoring a mother's reputation, and restoring a daughter's peace. The narrative must now move toward the lasting systemic change wrought by her identification, the legacy of the nameless. With the killer, George Taylor, already beyond the reach of the law, the narrative of justice in the case of Barbara Ann Hackman, Taylor became a trial of a different kind, a public and systemic reckoning. The true trial was conducted not in a courtroom with a jury, but in the arena of investigative policy and public ethics. The verdict was needed on the system that failed Barbara Ann for 30 years, and the methods that finally succeeded. The primary evidence presented in this metaphorical trial was the sheer compelling existence of the Doe Network. Todd Matthews became the accidental prosecutor, using Barbara Ann's story as the key exhibit. His argument was simple. The fragmented nature of law enforcement, the inability of Pennsylvania to communicate effectively with Kentucky across 30 years, was the real co-conspirator in George Taylor's crime of anonymity. The public reactions served as the jury. The verdict was overwhelmingly in favor of change. The empathy generated by Barbara Ann's story fueled a groundswell of support for initiatives that centralized missing persons data and encouraged the integration of private DNA data into police work. The name Tent Girl transformed from a tragic epitaph into a rallying cry for legislative reform. This public trial forced police agencies across the country to confront their own institutional rigidities. Why were they not cross-referencing old missing persons data with unidentified remains more consistently? Why was the focus almost exclusively on high-profile murders, leaving the transient and the anonymous to languish in storage? The answer was often resource depletion and jurisdictional paralysis. However, a new and complex legal challenge began to emerge in this phase: the ethical and legal standing of forensic genetic genealogy, the very method that was beginning to solve the next generation of cold cases. This was the most critical deliberation of the systemic trial. While Barbara Ann was identified using the early internet and conventional records, the explosion of cases being solved shortly after her identification, made possible by the private DNA databases used by the likes of the Golden State Killer Task Force, raised profound questions about privacy. Was it legal for law enforcement to search a private database containing millions of innocent citizens, genetic information without a warrant, simply because a distant relative uploaded their data? The defense of the method was powerful. It named the dead and caught the guilty, offering closure where none existed. The prosecution's argument was equally compelling. It potentially compromised the genetic privacy of millions who never consented to be part of a criminal investigation. This deliberation, fought in legal journals, ethics panels, and legislative hearings, became the true trial of the modern age of forensics. For the Hackman family, the resolution remained personal, circumventing the legal drama. They had their truth, and they had a name. The public debate about DNA and privacy felt distant, though it was built entirely on the foundations of cases like Barbara Ann's. Their final act was to transform their private grief into a public plea for vigilance, ensuring that other families didn't have to endure 3 decades of calculated deceit. The emotional climax for the family occurred during the testimony phase, sharing their mother's story with the world, ensuring that her life, not her murder, became the central focus. It was their way of finally exercising their voice, a right that George Taylor had stolen from them. They ensured the lasting narrative was that of a devoted mother whose memory was corrupted by a killer, but ultimately rescued by the determination of a good man. The verdict of this systemic trial, spanning years, was a slow, grudging acceptance of the new technology, tempered by the introduction of policies that governed how and when private databases could be searched. The legacy of Tent Girl was not merely one solved murder, but the forcing of a conversation that redefined the boundaries of privacy and policing in the digital age. The focus now turns to the final lingering questions, the aftermath, and the enduring meaning of her restored identity. The official closing of the file did not mark the end of the story. It signaled the beginning of the aftermath. The legacy of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor was not defined by the final police report, but by the ripple effect of her identity being restored. This ripple effect flowed primarily in 2 directions, into the lives of her family and into the future of cold case investigation. For Shelley Taylor, the daughter, the aftermath was a long, complex process of psychological reconstruction. The truth that her mother was a victim, not a deserter, was a liberation, but it necessitated the painful rejection of the man who had been her father, George Taylor. She had to reconcile the gentle presence of her childhood with the calculated cruelty of a killer who used his child as a cover story. The script must pause here to reflect on the nature of inherited trauma, the trauma of the murder itself, and the unique trauma of the decades of lies. The family's public narrative became one of advocacy. They spoke openly about the years of doubt, the bureaucratic stonewalling, and the sheer luck that connected them to Todd Matthews. Their emotional clarity provided an anchor to the broader public discussion, reminding everyone that behind the cold case file and the procedural arguments was a family who had been denied the basic right to mourn. The second and perhaps more powerful aftermath involved Todd Matthews. The closure of Barbara Ann's case was, for him, a launchpad. His identification of Tent Girl became the foundational myth of the Doe Network, transforming him from an obsessed amateur into a globally recognized expert and advocate. He had proven his hypothesis, that the collective memory of the Internet could achieve breakthroughs that isolated police departments could not. Todd's life, post-Tent Girl, became a constant, selfless pursuit of the nameless. He used Barbara Ann's story to raise awareness and funds, enabling the Doe Network to grow into the major non-profit partner it is today for law enforcement agencies. This period cemented his legacy as a true pioneer of the citizen detective movement, a direct spiritual heir to the unnamed girl in the Kentucky soil. The largest and most systemic aftermath was the undeniable acceleration of the use of genetic genealogy. While Barbara Ann's case was solved without the advanced technique, her story demonstrated the desperate need for such tools. By highlighting the system's failure, Todd's work paved the ethical and public relations path for the eventual widespread adoption of DNA genealogy. The hundreds of John and Jane Does subsequently named in the 2010s and 2020s are, in a very real sense, part of Barbara Ann's legacy. She became the symbolic first victory for a model that now prioritizes giving every victim their name back. There was a bittersweet coda to this entire procedural struggle. For years, The grave-marked Tent Girl had been a pilgrimage site for those obsessed with the mystery. When the headstone was replaced with Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, it symbolized the final, definitive end of the mystery. The folklore was replaced by fact. The anonymity was replaced by a history. Yet a subtle philosophical question remained for Todd Matthews. Was the process truly complete? The killer was dead, the name was restored, and the family was finally grieving. But the story of Barbara Ann, the woman who had traveled with the carnivals, who had left a small town for a chaotic life, contained depths that even the identification could not fully reveal. Her story, now a permanent fixture in the history of cold case justice, forces us all to look closer at the edges of society, at the transient lives, the marginalized, and the easily forgotten. The final truth is that it took a stranger's obsession to give her identity back, a profound indictment of the initial system. The life of Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor ended on a lonely road in Kentucky, but her story, resurrected by the tenacity of an outsider, became a permanent marker on the landscape of American justice. The aftermath of the Tent Girl case is not found in official archives, but in the psychological shift it forced upon us, the realization that anonymity is often a crime's greatest shield, and that simple human dedication can shatter it. The case's enduring legacy rests on its ability to demonstrate the power of the non-professional. Todd Matthews, the heavy equipment operator who became the pioneer of online sleuthing, proved that the key to unlocking the truth was often found outside the traditional structure of investigation. His success laid the groundwork for the modern digital volunteer movement, validating the instinct of citizens who refuse to let the lost remain forgotten. The emotional coda belongs to the concept of restorative justice. Although George Taylor escaped legal consequence, the restoration of Barbara Ann's name was a profound act of healing for her daughter, Shelley. The lie that had corrupted her memory for 30 years was excised, allowing her mother to finally rest with dignity and her daughter to be free of inherited shame. This final truth is the most powerful victory in the entire narrative. The final lingering question we must ask ourselves is this: how many other tent girls are still out there? How many unmarked graves are waiting for a stranger with a computer and an overwhelming sense of duty to speak their names? The revolution in genetic genealogy has provided the tools, but it is the moral imperative born from cases like Barbara Ann's that provides the motivation. The nameless should not rely on luck, but on a guaranteed system of accountability that spans every jurisdiction. Her story demands that we never mistake bureaucratic inertia for fate. Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, once a phantom on the side of a highway, is now a permanent reminder that every victim has a story waiting to be told, and every unsolved case carries the potential for profound, late-arriving truth. Her life was tragically cut short, but her legacy endures in the hundreds of other victims who have since been given back their identity. Her name echoes in the digital halls of justice, a testament to the fact that even the most hopeless cold case can be solved when someone simply refuses to let go. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and lock your door, think about this. How many stories remain untold waiting beneath the surface of silence? How many forgotten names still linger in unmarked graves, hoping to be spoken again? I'll leave you with that question. This is Mythos and Murder Manor. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have theories, thoughts, or other cases you'd like me to investigate, share them in the comments, and remember, monsters don't live under your bed. Sometimes they live right next door.